welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 36. My guest in this episode is Eric Black, filmmaker, director, cinematographer. And in this interview, we discuss two of the films he's created in the last 10 years, along with Frauke Sandig. And the first film is called Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth from 2011. And it is a film about Mayan culture. And the film crosses from Chiapas, Mexico into Guatemala and follows the lives of around 10 protagonists. And it is a beautiful and rich film. It also addresses some of the challenges faced by the Mayan culture in modern times and in recent history. And there is an arrival of a gold mine that threatens the health and safety of the people living in the area. So it's a beautiful film, but it also illustrates the challenges faced by the Mayan indigenous culture. The second film is from 2021 called Aware, and it is a film that features about a half a dozen protagonists, from philosophers to neuroscientists to Buddhist scholars to plant scientists. So it's a rich film when it comes to discussing the idea of consciousness. I invite you to join Eric and myself as an observer of this conversation, and I hope that it is a rich experience for you. And thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome Eric Black to the IdeaCast interview series. And Eric, I'm grateful to have you on board, and thank you for joining me in a conversation today. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Justin.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, a good interview is actually a privilege, I think.
I like it because it's such a beautiful exchange of ideas and thoughts, and so I always look forward to these. And we brought you here today to talk about two of your films, and I will, for the YouTube audience, I will have all links to the films that are being discussed in this interview in the description field. And I encourage you all to go check out the trailers, and you can have access to Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth through Vimeo. If you have a Vimeo account, I have one. It took me 2 seconds to rent the movie. You can even buy the movie, so I would encourage that. And likewise for Aware, when you go to the site, there are ways that you can then navigate to where you can rent the film. So now that I've let everyone know that we're going to be talking about two of your films, let's say I will introduce the films. We have first Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth, and I think it's necessary to start with that film, both chronologically as well as the Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth sort of peaks itself or segues itself into your other film that we'll be discussing today, Aware, and it has a nice, beautiful relevance to that film as well. Not direct, but there's a character in there in the way of Josefina that I appreciate seeing her again in that film. So can we start with Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth? And my impression, my takeaway, I watched it 2 days ago, and I thought it was such a beautiful insight into a ethically and morally evolved culture and a beautiful culture. And also it was contrasted with a less civilized culture, I think. And I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to spoil the film for anybody, but that's my takeaway, is that we see these beautiful people living, just like everyone else. They're living their lives, and there's ups and downs and so forth. But we do really see an intrusion that's sort of iterative. It's I interviewed a traumatologist last year, and she talks about fractal patterns in trauma. And it reminded me of that, and these fractal patterns that keep reoccurring. And so first we had colonialism with these, and I'm going to let you discuss or explain some of this because you will do a much better job than me. But anyway, that was my takeaway as I was seeing those repeating patterns. So can you tell us about Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth, and this beautiful creation of yours?
Well, Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth is about and with the indigenous Maya of today. It's, interestingly enough, it's so often said that the Maya, I don't think anybody believes that anymore, but for the longest time, people would say that Maya died out, and yet there are 13 million indigenous Maya in lower Mexico, meaning Chiapas and the Yucatan and Guatemala, and to a certain extent Honduras and Belize. And anyway, it's actually a very rigid geographic area, but it's now been split up by all these different countries. And but the point of the film, I mean, one of the big points was to have only indigenous people speak and speak for themselves. I mean, obviously we're the filmmakers as white European filmmakers, but really it was constructed as a podium, sort of speak, to do something which fortunately is less and less rare, but so often in these films about indigenous people, you have indigenous people doing something in the foreground and somebody else moderating it, telling you what they think and what they do. And as someone who studied anthropology, the last thing I wanted to do was an ethnology. This is really an advocacy film, you know, where the Maya say exactly what they think and what's going on and what they've endured. And in the case of particularly Guatemala, this isn't even post-colonial. I think it's a colonial, ongoing colonial situation. And Guatemala had the worst human rights record in the world for 10 straight years. Thank you, Ronald Reagan, also for supplying them with all those Huey helicopters that we were done with in Vietnam, and managed to kill or disappear 250,000 Maya in a very short period of time. That said, I mean, to continue on that vein, I would also say that it was some of the sweetest people I've ever met, and I felt such a privilege of being there. And it's always this contrast of this, as you say, these incredibly sweet people and the psychopathic government who's done everything. I mean, colonialism continue. I mean, we know as, or I know as an American, or we know as an American, what we did to Native Americans here. And in Central America, or well, Mexico is actually North America, but Central America for the Maya, that continues. I mean, sometimes you couldn't really even believe it. You know, you would be sitting there in the very people that you're, you know, probably including my great-great-grandparents, were massacring, especially right here in Ohio with Tecumseh. And there you were sitting with them, and were you friends. I mean, it's suggesting, more than suggesting, this completely other relationship that we could have had. But I think what in retrospect, what I really brought is that I am a product of the civil rights movement myself. I mean, I'm not Black, I'm not a person of color, but it affected me from my earliest age. I mean, I actually was born the month that Rosa Parks stayed on the bus, planned and stayed on the bus. I mean, amazing woman. And when we got to Mexico and we're researching this, you're sort of surprised that this kind of civil rights movement hasn't happened. I mean, it's not that people aren't trying, but the same sort of civil rights and thinking about race, although race isn't maybe the right word here, needed to happen. And that's, you know, and I hope that we did help that happen. I mean, it certainly was, it was extremely well received by Indigenous people all over the Americas. It played in every single human rights festival listed by the Human Rights Network in the Americas, North, Central, and South, and won many, many Indigenous film festivals, and was even being shown in these little vans that would go around like we used to, you know,
right, pull down the screen.
Here. Yeah, pull out a screen or a side of a barn, whatever, and show it. And that was really the largest compliment we've ever had. And we'd get these messages also from older Maya who had seen them. It was a wonderful privilege, Justin, what it was. I mean, I think I've gone off axis on your question a little bit, but yeah, it talks about not only, first part of the film talks about the Maya cosmovision, their vision of the world. And really the beautiful parts about Maya civilization And then it gets into what's happening today through transnationals and the destruction of nature and their fight to preserve it in spite of us often. Anyway, I'll let you get another question before I go on.
Well, you brought up transnationals, and one of the if we could say one of the elements of the film, and something that I alluded to earlier, is that this savagery emerges in the film, and you illustrate quite effectively the impact of a what I would call a strip mine in the forests of was that Chiapas that the mine was located?
No, that's Guatemala. In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. Okay,
unfortunately, because even the Guatemalans have even less rights than the Chapanecos.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean there's a historical reasons for that as well, but
sure.
Yeah.
And so the film was made in 2011, and that to me presents a question: is that still ongoing?
Well, yes and no. That particular mine, the Marlin mine, which was the largest in Central America, is no longer going. But that just means that they're moving over. You know, as Modilia in the film says to one of our protagonists, that vein goes all the way through the Sierra Madre, you know, all the way down. So they're just going to move over. And what it means is that they just left all of this contaminated, toxic soil. They drained the lake, you know, into the rivers. So yes, it's gone. Maybe more important to say is that within a 5-year period, Guatemala, or let's put it, the government of Guatemala, sold 5% of its national territory to transnational mining corporations. I think it was either 99 or 95% on indigenous land without their consent. So whether it's there or any place else, and in Chiapas, it's the same story as well, with indigenous people all throughout Mexico and frankly, all throughout the world. These mining concerns are a particularly brutal, you know, that's where you really see the conquest. I think in Vancouver, where Goldcorp is located, Vancouver has, I believe at the time it was 966 mining corporations just in Vancouver, the city of Vancouver alone, which it's almost like Madrid at the turn of the, you know, at the 15th century, mining gold throughout Latin America without people's consent and with, you know, and hiring paramilitaries to protect their mines, the same people who were doing the genocide before. Now that's an uplifting way to start a conversation, I think. You know, but
well,
it's so horrendous that you sometimes as a journalist you can't even believe what you're reading yourself.
And I will say to those who are who have not yet seen the film and are curious about the film, that the first 35 or 40 minutes or so, again, it's a beautiful, I keep using the word beautiful because the cinematography was great and the people were very beautiful. So I don't mind wearing that term out in this description of this film. I won't do it so much in Aware because Aware is just fascinating, but I'll burn fascinating out in Aware. But anyway, the beauty is in the first 35 or 40 minutes, we don't have insight into the mining operation, and we just see people getting through day to day. They are describing hardships. They are, you know, you get some insight and a little bit of a peek into what they have to deal with beyond just everybody's need to feed themselves and keep clean water nearby and those kind of things and look after their children. So it's still a very beautiful film, but it has a message in it that I think needs to be told. And as you pointed out, the story unfolds across the planet with disempowered people. And, you know, so I wasn't naive to that going into the film, but it's nonetheless, it's unfortunate that that happens. You know, I see when in our own country, we commit these similar violations for the sake of hydrocarbon fuel. And I see that as being, no less excusable, but nonetheless, when you weigh gold against petroleum, petroleum, unfortunately, is what we're all dependent on. We're very fragile in that regard, but gold is for aesthetics. So that's how I would weigh this situation in terms of the gravity of the lack of moral capacity of the people who are exploiting this land through the mining, is that it is merely for aesthetics, because the value of gold is purely an abstraction. And yes, admittedly, it is some standard for some people. We don't have the gold standard anymore. We just have good faith or whatever. So another abstraction. So to destroy people's lives and to toxify an ecosystem based on abstraction, based on the need or want rather for mineral resources that could be debatable as far as is it worth it? I think that's an important part of what you're seeing there in the say last third of the film. So I'm sorry to hear that there wasn't this groundswell of outrage and turnaround, but I'm sure your film had a significant impact. As you said, it was being shown in the indigenous culture film circuit and film festival circuit, but it was also throughout the world, right? I think you were entered into 10 or more film festivals with that, with Heart of Sky, Heart of Earth.
No, 115.
150. Okay, I only had access to, I think, about 10 that I saw.
There's another thing I'd like to add into that. I mean, lest people get the impression that it's just about the poor Maya. A lot of it is about Mayan spirituality.
Oh, yeah.
And this mix between the spiritual and the political, which is often something that's very hard for someone from the West to understand, that it's, and in fact, and particularly in Germany, we had a lot of people asking us, so why didn't you just show us the political side? Or why didn't you just show us the, from the New Age community, why isn't it just the spiritual side? And the reason is because the Maya don't divide the world that way themselves. And I would also say that has had a huge effect on me, as we'll get into when we get into Aware, that Aware is really a response. And it's also the second part of the trilogy coming out of Heart of Sky, Heart of Earth. But they are very much talking about their spiritual roots and their spiritual beliefs, which also means not being separate from the world, particularly the natural world. That there's a line where Flory, one of our chief protagonists in Heart of Sky, says, you white people, you see the tree, the house, the lake, whatever. I'm not sure exactly what she says, but you see it all as separate. We indigenous people, we see things as interconnected. And I think that, well, first of all, that, not only that, but certainly she was provoking us. I mean, she was really sort of pointing right at us. And so that Aware, and we'll get into this later, I understand, but Aware was really a response to that, to take our cameras and turn them around, not necessarily directly on ourselves, but to look at Western civilization and our spirituality and our incorporating nature into our own, or not incorporating it into our own worldview.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was focusing sort of on the cynicism, but you're right. And that's the beauty that I'm probably was inferring there, is that they do cover the Popol Vuh creation narrative. That I love how the gods experimented with making us out of mud and water first. That didn't work out. They tried wood. That didn't work out. And corn, maize,
Right.
And it's the sort of the life giver and the life sustainer in that culture, and the harvesting of the corn and the cycles and in their interaction with it. And actually I think, and I only watched the film once, so I didn't get, I could have committed it better to memory, but Heart of Sky, Heart of Earth is part of that creation story. That the earth was created. I can't do it justice. Yeah.
Well, Ukush is Heart of Sky, Heart of Earth are actually gods, Ukush Ka and Ukush Ulef. And they are the creator gods who come together to create the earth. And So that's where that enters in. That's why the title.
Okay.
Yeah. And it comes up all the time. I mean, and I pray to them myself in the meantime.
Yeah. I don't blame you.
Yeah.
How long did I think when we were having our pre-meeting the other day, you mentioned how long you were in that area in southern Mexico and Guatemala. How long did you stay there?
Well, we were with the Maya in that area for 3 years altogether. Okay. Some of that was when we were distributing it after the fact. I mean, it was very important that this film got out to the indigenous communities for us, and also got throughout Latin America. So we were working on that more than we normally would to make sure. And we have it on YouTube in Spanish for free as well, so that a lot of indigenous people, of course, have very little money, and they use these little cafes. So we've made a point of keeping that going as well.
Okay. And despite my having brought up the issue with the intrusion of a mining corporation, I don't want to scare anybody off. This film is not preachy. It is not pedantic in any way. It's illustrating, it's the unflinching eye of the lens. And so again, the first 2/3 of the film is, a cosmological inquiry. It's cultural curiosity. It is examining the lives of people going about their day-to-day living, and some of the adversity that is there baked into life, and also the legacy of what's gone on in that region in the last 500 years. The introduction of the gold mine is done objectively, in my opinion. There's no pedantic narrative or anything like that. So I want to say that to the YouTube audience, because this is not a preachy film at all.
And there's no narration too, which is very much part of the way we make documentaries.
Absolutely. So I want people to be curious about this film. And again, I will have access to the website where you can watch the trailer, because it is a well shot film, and you will find yourself taken in by these persons that were filmed in Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about in Heart of Skay, Heart of Earth? And then we can slowly
I could go on all day.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
I figured we could start that in between zone, but between the two films, and then dive into Aware. Well,
one thing I think that is, I mean, you can sort of guess at this, but our Mayan friends would often, I mean, this is not when we were filming necessarily, we'd be sitting around having dinner and they would ask you, well, where are you on your spiritual path? And, I come from Central Ohio, and nobody asks you where, or if they do, you kindly move 10 feet away. Or,
take their pamphlet and walk away.
And it happens so often, and these are our good friends, and you would have to sort of say, well, you'd have to think about that. And it's, I'm someone who grew up very much in an agnostic family. I mean, I think in some ways deeply spiritual, but agnostic. I mean, my grandfather believed, I mean, if he believed in anything, it was in Thoreau and Emerson. And he was a transcendentalist, and named his oldest son Walden after Walden Pond. I mean, that's how deeply it goes. And in some ways, I've had to re-examine my own roots in terms of transcendentalists, that I hold these values and these spiritual values. I mean, I might not have called them that before this, but I was very happy up until relatively recently with this Cartesian dialectic, in my mind, in the Cartesian dialectic, which is to say the spiritual in one hand and science in the other, or sort of as though one had nothing to do with the other. And in retrospect, after making Aware, and also being with the Maya, but Aware sort of culminated that, and that's a ridiculous idea. I mean, I can't believe that I went through all my whole life thinking that this was something to be, proud of. And I've had to re-examine a lot of that, a lot of things about my own spirituality. I don't mean religion, I mean spirituality.
Right.
And it led us to Aware. I mean, not just me, but also Frauke, the co-director in this film, led us both to Aware to go examine our own beliefs and focusing on consciousness. I mean, what better way to get to our own beliefs than to look at science? Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah.
No,
I
go
do
ahead.
want to say one more thing. I mean, probably a lot of things about the Maya and Guatemala, though, and that it is, again, I would just want to reiterate, this is just one of the sweetest group of people I've ever come across. And in spite of the horrors that are happening in Central America, or because of them, we shouldn't look away. I mean, as an audience, as a group, I mean, we need to look at this. I mean, we need to keep our eyes open, and we need to be helping, not only just helping, but cooperating also to save nature. And which I think, I mean, it's all, the film is also, Heart of Sky is not just about, although only the Maya are in it, it's not just about the Maya. It's really about the way we treat indigenous people and have treated indigenous people since, at least 500 years. And of course, it goes way even farther back than that. And reevaluate that, because I also think that the only way we're going to save these places that are so critical to us is to have an alliance with indigenous people. I mean, it's, like we're still, in Tanzania right now, or I think it's Tanzania, we're trying to move the Maasai off of their natural land so we can build a national park where people can go hunting. I mean, this makes no sense at all. I mean, that kind of attitude, we need to learn about indigenous people, and we need to stick up for them. And yeah, I think it's on both sides. So don't look away.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we enter into discussion of Aware, I think one of the takeaways for me is to look, it's not looking back, but it's looking in another direction from where we are as a Western culture, I'll say that, and where we've come in the last, or where we've come from in the last 300 years. And I'm referring to the Enlightenment project, where, as you said a moment ago, there is this Cartesian dualism and this notion of empiricism over, and rationality over frivolity and folly and so forth, which is how we look at the primitives and the people who are still, wearing crazy costumes and, shaking around and doing these things that we don't understand. But to me, honestly, that's sort of the pinnacle of human accomplishment when it comes to this synthesis of, as you said a little while ago, the balance between spirituality, which I would call the psyche, and the rationalist, empiricist aspect of our being, is that we do need to incorporate that and not become so lost in this Mr. Spock kind of, mindset that it just, because I think it is destroying us. And I think we're seeing evidence of that throughout, not to critique too much, but I think we're seeing evidence of that now, whether it's nihilism or vapid consumerism or whatever you want to call it, that sensibility that we find in, again, indigenous people and people unaffected by the, I'm trying to use gentle words here, but the missionaries that, brought our religion to them and so forth. We need to preserve that, and we need to embrace it, in my opinion. And there's obvious exceptions. We are benefiting well from technology and from modern medicine and all these things. So I'm certainly not critical of that. But I think
and I myself love science. I mean, I have a deep love of science, and my family is. I mean, my mother's family, really some amazing scientists on that part. And I need my New York Times Science Times, and I read about science all the time.
Yeah.
And yet it's also very important to understand what science is and is not. And I think, and that's, I mean, we've forgotten that it's a method. It's the scientific method is what we're talking about. I mean, talking about scientists, you get into sort of a cult idea or almost a religion, I think. And I mean, the other thing that I would say is that not only holding science and spirituality in a balance, but I think that there's not even necessarily a contradiction between them. And I would point to the fact that, I mean, one piece of evidence in that direction is that I think many of our greatest scientists have been deeply spiritual people or have become deeply spiritual people. I mean, the cliche is Einstein, but oh my God, you know, that man, for all his talking about being an atheist, the awe, the sense of awe that he felt about the universe is this very, I mean, he says as much as a deeply spiritual thing. Or David Bohm, you know, Bohm is, or as we quote, you know, is often quoted or referred to in Aware is Max Planck. That here's the father of quantum physics, the most a consummate scientist with an enormous amount of integrity because he didn't even want to believe what he had revealed to himself about another set of physical laws underneath Newtonian and later Einsteintonian, I guess that's the way you say it, physics. It was the laws of quantum mechanics. And yet at the end of his life, he says, consciousness is fundamental and everything else in the universe is secondary. Now, this gets pretty close to Buddhism or even more closer to Hinduism.
Right.
And yet, again, a scientist, and you can just go right down the line of great scientists and see that, you know, it is not so, it's not at all clear where spirituality and science are divided anyway, except in the sort of in the minds of, well, I'd almost say simple-minded, you know, because it's that's unfair. But no, it's everywhere. And the more we get into particularly quantum physics, the more that we learn about, I mean, things like entanglement or the double slit experiment are so far beyond anything that we could imagine. Or let's start with the Big Bang, right? Which, by the way, was discovered, or the math was done by a Catholic priest, by the way, not Einstein. Einstein wouldn't believe it. But that idea that the entire universe came from a particle that was smaller than an atom is beyond anything any of us can even conceptualize.
Yeah, the way I tend to navigate these waters is, as you said, science is a method, and it's bookended on both ends by philosophy. So if you're going to do science, you first have to think and discuss and be metaphysical or pre-metaphysical, whatever that is in the beginning. And you have to go into your science with some sense of epoche, some sense of not being dogmatic or presupposing anything. And I think that's what gets some people in trouble, because I love to listen to the physicalist argument versus things like process relational and idealism and all these different things, which are all philosophy. But I get nervous sometimes. You come across people and are like, we have no need for philosophy anymore. We've got science now. And it's like, you can't do science without philosophy, and you certainly can't do philosophy without being informed by science. And so in that, I would weave in spirituality, that spirituality can and should be informed by philosophical discourse or whatever, dialectic. And then also science can rein in spirituality, because we can certainly go off on our imagination is unlimited. And
Here.
so
Yeah.
I see where science can ground that. And, you know, my biggest thing that I love with spirituality is I think it's inherent within us. And so just as there are many wills out there, there's Frankl's will to meaning and Nietzsche's will to power, which often gets misunderstood, and other wills.
I thought you were going to say Will Shakespeare in there.
Yeah, well, there's Will Shakespeare, you know, Freud's will to sex and all this other stuff. Yeah. But there's a will to me, there's a will to spirit. There's a will to ask those questions and want to know. It's you shouldn't, you know, hold it against anybody to want to know what's beyond death or, you know, any of these things. And I think that's all stuff that should not be, we should be granted that as people. And so for scientists and scientismists to say, oh, no, you're irrational, you're silly, and you're primitive, and you shouldn't go there. I've got all your answers, right? I just don't buy it, just as much as I don't buy religion either.
I think that's why consciousness and the study of consciousness is particularly interesting, is because ever since Descartes in 1630, we haven't gotten any farther with consciousness at all. I mean, we have no more idea than Descartes did about consciousness, and that's not 300 years, that's 400 years, as though 300 years wasn't enough. But I wanted to back up just a little bit in that it is also important to look at what was happening just before, at the time of the inception of the Age of Reason, which in my mind, the biggest thing was that we had the Inquisition and we had the burning of the witches, which to me, especially after having lived with in Guatemala with all of these shaman, I mean, everybody who's intelligent, I'm over exaggerating, but with the Maya, they're shaman. And it turns out, unbeknownst to us as well, but the majority of our protagonists in Heart of Skye were shaman and curanderas, I mean, people who heal with herbs, etc. These are exactly the women, in particular women, who were being put to the stake, including almost my own great-great-great-grandmother, 13 generations back, was taken out of Gloucester, and was tried as a witch, and was, fortunately, she escaped that fate. But this is neither here nor there. I guess I'm just proud of that.
Yeah.
But what I want to get to is that we had to destroy a lot of our own indigenous, maybe indigenous isn't the right word, but knowledge before we even got to the Age of Reason, or reason was used as the reason we destroyed so much of our knowledge about nature, our relationship to nature, our herbs, etc. And let's not forget establishing patriarchy at the same time, even more than at the time. Yeah. One more link. Yeah. So yes, but back to what I wanted to say at the beginning is that what's particularly interesting about conscious to me is that it brings science to its limits. And I think that pretty much anybody there are people who say, oh, our brains are just a computer made of meat, but this is ridiculous. I mean, this is not really looking at something even empirically. There's something so different about consciousness that you can't put it in the same category as the material world. And it's not that I know, but I certainly have a very deep feeling that is simply not going to happen in the way that we've been investigating it, which is, well, we have that in the film with Christoph Koch, who here he is, the head of the Allen Brain Institute, 300 scientists working underneath him, although not all of them are investigating consciousness by any means. But here he is saying, after all of these years, that, we're not going to find consciousness this way. I mean, he imitates, or he mimics what Matthieu Ricard says, the Buddhist monk, right after him, saying, neuroscientists know very well that we're not going to find the origins or the basis of consciousness through looking down farther and farther and farther and farther down in. It's like Michael Faraday back in 1840 saying, the farther you get into matter, the more you realize it's not there. There's no there. And now we're in string theory and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're in the rabbit hole now.
Yeah, we've gone to
just rely on science. Although again, I love science. I love reading about it. But I go into spirituality myself, holding on to the handrail of science.
Yeah. I mean, I am a naturalist when it comes to science, so I don't really, for my own self, this is just me, I don't seek transcendence per se, and I don't seek supernatural phenomena to be a part of my spirituality. I think that the mystery of, like you said, conscious experience and the mystery of something from nothing and some of these ineffable things, these insoluble things that happen, should be left as mysteries. And I think given, and we've talked about the weight of some of our critical solutions that need to be found in everything, whether it's energy or food or social relations and so forth. That to me is spirituality, because if we realize, and I don't use the word sacred very often, but the sacred nature of relationships, if you want to say that, between people, and how there's a shadow and a light to that. To me, that's where spirituality might flourish, I think. And you can be a theist, you can be a non-theist, you know, and still meet in that common ground where we might explore compassion and empathy and cooperation and tolerance and things like that. And so to me, that is a sort of sweet spot where we can flourish in conversation and sharing and seeing a good way forward, or a way forward that is comfortable for everyone, or that works for, not everyone, but works for people. And that's how I dance around spirituality.
I do understand your hesitancy about using the word spirituality, and maybe also particularly here in Central Ohio, which is, you know, the evangelical capital of America traditionally. I mean, historically, if you look, I mean, the amount of movements that have come about out of Ohio is rather incredible. But after all of this experience with these protagonists, in not the Maya certainly also, but I think I feel a little more comfortable about even going further than that. And I would pull out of the bag these experiments that are being done at Johns Hopkins with psilocybin. To me are mind-blowing, and it's made me open up more to things that I might have considered completely implausible before, and ask questions that are more out there, questions which I associate with the New Age, which I've always been so allergic to New Age that but I find myself more empathetic to that within reason. Lousy way of putting it. But let's just put it this way. Here it is, 600 people, there have been 600 trips with full doses of psilocybin now. And these are being administered to normal people who have no drug experience. And meaning people from right there from the area in New Jersey or Baltimore. And again, people who do not have, who aren't out there to use drugs, who for some reason are doing this in this experiment. And yet, almost 80%, 79% said that this 4 to 5 hour experiment was one of the 5 most important spiritual experiences of their lives, on par with the death of a parent or the birth of a first child. I mean, that's the scale we're talking on here. And almost 40% have said that 4 to 5 hour experience was the most important experience of their entire lives, 40%. Where I have to say, my God, what on earth is it that people are connecting to here? I mean, I don't even have a language for it.
Right.
But they do. I mean, they talk about spiritual. Some people talk about God. Some people talk about the divine. Some people talk about the infinite. And that's why it's, of course, not only in the film, but it's also why this has had such an enormous effect on me to actually have to say, what on earth is going on here? And
Yeah.
how do I, it's not empirical in the sense that how do you analyze someone's individual trip? But when you've got 700 of them, then it's different. Then we're talking about a quantity, even alone the question, why is it that we are pre-wired for mystical experience in the human brain already is something that is, I mean, you could spend your whole life just analyzing or researching that. But I think going back to David Bohm is that there's something out there. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like a Mars mission or something like that, but there is something so ineffable out there that I can't even conceive of it. And that's something I would have felt very uncomfortable even saying 10 years ago. Sure. I just would not have accepted that period.
Sure, absolutely. And so to take one step further on what I was saying a moment ago, where I'm a naturalist and it's not so much to say that I limit I'm closing any doors. I leave. What I do is I borrow from Christian mysticism, where some of the mystics will say, "Get out of the way and let God consume you." And it's a negative theology. It is a negative process of negation, and I find that attractive in that there's no contrivance when you're a reductionist, let's say, and you eliminate rhetoric, you eliminate speculation, and you admit to the ineffable, you admit that there is a mystery. And for me, and again, I'm just speaking to myself of myself here, that for me is profound. And yes, I've had psychedelic experiences that were pretty interesting. And I've actually had meditation, mystical experiences where I have been just absolutely overwhelmed by even more than what LSD could provide, but this absolute profound sense of love, connection, not quite a pure non-dual state, but I've gotten into non-dual states in meditation to a small degree. But this one experience I had was just, I was crying. It was a braingasm, basically. It was one of the powerful things I've ever felt in my life. And I wasn't taking DMT or anything like that. So I embrace that. But like I said, I think I take the approach of negation. That way, cults can't be formed from it, and conviction cannot be born of it. Dogma cannot arise from it, because I see what the Christian mystics were doing, and in the Sufi mystics as well, as they were saying, just get out of your own. And the Buddhists talk about this, dissolve the self, dissolve the boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, and all sorts of things. I mean, well, and the indigenous traditions, certainly all throughout the Americas, which were all, I think maybe, except maybe for the Inuit in the north, they were all doing, I mean, even doing sounds like a pejorative, but they were all involved in these psychedelic substances, which they and I consider, they either consider them medicine or as spiritual vehicles. I mean, they certainly weren't doing it as a recreation.
Right.
And now we know that the Maya were doing that also, even though the Maya of today don't even know that. I mean, we have it from scraping the ancient pots that we see what was in there. Okay. But yeah, there's so much out there. So I agree. I've held the door. I've opened that door much wider. And I would say that, and the dominant theory, as I understand it from Roland Griffiths, is that the dominant theory about what psilocybin does is almost exactly what Aldous Huxley wrote in The Doors of Perception in 1952. We've come right around full circle. And is to say that what you perceive on psilocybin is all that your brain is capable of. And most of your brain is working as a filter to keep you from having these perceptions, because we need it. We can't walk down the stairs. No. We can't do anything unless we have this ego in place and these restrictive filters. But it opens up the question about, so what does the world look like, or what does the universe look like
Yeah.
without these filters. And that's what's so fascinating, is not that it's a drug, but it's the opposite of a drug.
Yeah.
That you are maybe for the first time in your life seeing clearly. Now I'm exaggerating for effect, but that's also what Roland Griffiths, the head of the department at Johns Hopkins, says, is that what you're seeing is, yeah, all that you're capable of without these filters. And it certainly opens up. I mean, I keep mentioning David Bohm, this great quantum physicist, maybe one of the greatest, and also because of this film that came out about him, Infinite Potential, which also is a wonderful film that opened up a lot of things about him that I didn't. He could have been the seventh protagonist in Aware really easily had he been alive. I mean, but this idea of opening yourself and allowing these things, the things that we intuit to come through. And at the same time, I share your fear of cults and orthodox religion. I'm a great supporter of spirituality, and much less so for religion. I see them as almost diametrically opposed forces. I mean, we can get into that if you like, but I keep coming back to a paraphrasing Krishnamurti, which is that if you're walking through a spiritual forest and you see a path, don't take it. It's not yours. You've got to make your own. And I believe that.
Yeah, I agree. The cynic in me likes to think that religion is the bureaucracy of spirituality, and it's a human intellect driven, and it served a purpose, and it has shadow and light. In fact, if I were to ever get behind a tremendous, desperately needed project, is the reformation of the Abrahamic belief systems, and starting with Christianity maybe, is to see a reformation, a second one within Christianity, to go back to the sort of grassroots and understanding allegory and understanding the mythos, understanding what was being taught in the didactics, and so just filtering that and getting rid of the theory X political cultural manipulation, and just going right to the purity of, because I love the story of Christ, and I love the story of what went on before and after, and so there's things there that are of great value, and they are of great they're great heuristics, they're great teaching tools. And so I would love to see people with the courage to get in and reform that and bring out, and there are people doing. Mark Vernon is a good example. There are non-dual Christians like Francis Xavier Connolly and Richard Rohr, the late Thomas Merton, who was a friar Trappist monk, and he actually went off to Southeast Asia and was interacting with the Dalai Lama and just really got it. And they all had their moments where they broke through. And so I'm highly supportive of that. I'd love to see that really move and get some gravity, because they already have the foundation established. They have a billion loyal Catholics, have close to a billion. Evangelicals, or the non-Catholic, the Protestants, have several hundred million. So I mean, there's a lot of things in place, and if the narrative could change, people will hopefully benefit from that, and we'll see less fear in religion and less manipulation in religion, and more of what perhaps was meant in the early days.
I think, unfortunately, that religion is tied to power.
Yeah.
And I think that is highly problematic. And and that's something that, I mean, it's not to say that and it's certainly with early Christianity, and we can go into that too. Of course, there's a huge value in that, but I think as soon as it gets to Constantine, and I think he flipped it, and I mean, that's why it's on the shields of the Roman Empire, or the Roman armies. I can go into that too, having lived a long time in Rome. But what I think, though, is that you don't have to go to Christianity, you don't have to go to Buddhism, you don't have to go to any one of these individual things. There is something that is simply there. And I think that maybe that's what I find particularly attractive about Buddhism, is this and I'm not advocating that anyone become a Buddhist, but I would say one of the things I love about Buddhism is the democracy involved, that no one can prevent you from touching on the divine, for lack of a better term, or from having these mystical experiences for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's the great equalizer. And as is, as are psychedelics, as is yoga, as
Mm-hmm.
are these things, you don't need this intervening sort of telephone operator to connect you to the divine. Again, these words always sort of catch in my throat a little bit.
Yeah.
But and that is of great interest to me. We don't have to go back and reform Christianity. It's what we're trying to connect with is just there. There's no place to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's in here.
Yeah.
Again, not again, but I will say this too for anybody who hasn't figured this out already, is that researching consciousness for 7 years doesn't make you an expert on anything.
Mm-hmm.
It just gives you more questions. But I just wanted to add one thing, and it has nothing to do with our film particularly, but I think going back to early Christianity, what gets lost, I think, is that early Christianity was also the result and the attempt to overthrow the brutality of the Roman Empire.
Mm.
And I think we've lost sight of that an incredible percentage of the Roman Empire were slaves. I have a figure in my mind, but I'd have to check it to be sure, but it's so large. And when this point was really driven home to me personally, was in Sicily on the top of this little hill. There's a little tiny chapel, not even the size of a garage. And then you read on a little plexiglass plaque next to it that right here, 120,000 Roman slaves held 3 Roman legions at bay, until they were all slaughtered, of course. But amazing. I mean, that's the kind of brutality that we're talking about. It was a way of uniting people who didn't speak the same language or spoke Latin poorly, no doubt, who had been brutally taken from their own homes, including indigenous people, made to fight on other parts of, or slaves on other parts of the empire, trying to unite against this evil empire. For as many wonderful things as the Roman did, the brutality of the Roman Empire is right up there with, I as a kid, I loved everything Roman. And in the process of investigating that over my life, I've gone, oh my God. This bathhouse took 20,000 slaves 10 years to make. I mean, that's the reality of it. Okay, we're quite a ways from where, Justin. You're supposed to be in line here.
I know. Well, no, I think we're still slightly we have a gossamer thread holding us on there, because
all right, good.
I think the point of aware is to get us to think about is to think about things that some folks, I'm obsessed with it. So I think about this all the time, but thinking about some of these challenging questions, and your protagonists, you have one that deals with plant sentience or plant proto-consciousness, which when I'm not doing this, I love horticulture and botany, and, and I immerse myself in that, and I earn a living sort of ish from that too. And so that fascinates me. Yeah. So these questions, I think, along with self-discovery and self-awareness, socially and culturally, I think is good medicine. And it's a good way of learning about the self as well as the other. And so consciousness is this Indra's net or fabric or whatever you want to call it that makes us all equal, just like our molecules of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen make us all the same, and I'm not saying that in a cultural sense, I'm just saying physiologically we're the same.
Yeah, all chemicals that required a supernova to create, but yes.
Yeah. So we can look at it in that perspective.
Well, I'm glad you pulled me out of that too, because by no means is aware only by psychedelics. I mean, it certainly goes into it, and we followed these Johns Hopkins studies for 3 years. And with just one, I mean, they really are become friends of ours. I mean, wonderful, wonderful people. But Monica, too, the plant researcher in this film, is just, I mean, one of the best things about being a documentary filmmaker is that you get to hang out with these unbelievable people. I mean, it makes you very humble at the same time because, you know, I grew up fighting the idea that some people were smarter than others. And when you're in the presence of people who really do think differently, who are genius in their own fields, it's amazing to be around them and even be able to just ask questions of these people over these years and to have these conversations, often going till late in the night also. But Monica is incredibly charismatic woman in her own right. We call her the Jane Goodall of plants.
There you go. That's awesome.
And I think that's appropriate. I mean, Jane Goodall talked about in 1960 being at Cambridge, and you know, nobody would discuss the feelings of animals. It was taboo. You weren't even allowed to talk about it. She said, the only person I could commiserate was, I'd come home and I'd commiserate with my dog. And with Monica, really what she did is so simple, but she was the first really to simply take, she decided she didn't want to be a marine biologist anymore. She didn't want to kill anything anymore for reasons she explains about in the film. But what she did was to take experiments which had traditionally been done with animals, like the classic with Pavlov's dog with the bell, salivating with the food, and applied them to plants. And what's amazing about Monica is the experiments are incredibly simple often. I mean, that's their beauty. But it was just that she was the first one who had the idea of testing plants for essentially consciousness. And it's that they can do all of these things that, you know, not the same way we do them, but that they learn, that they, you know, that they see, that they hear, that they, all of these things which we associate with consciousness, they're doing them. They don't have neurons or a brain, but they actually have more of their circuitry, more of their genes are programmed than is for us. And maybe that makes them more intelligent than we are. I mean, we certainly, this is something my grandfather would have been happy to hear and believed anyway. I mean, and maybe not quite the way I've explained it, but now we have to think about trees and forests and plants in a very, very different way, because we can see, we can hear, we can use, you know, we can now use a mic to record the sounds of roots. We know that this is going on in the same way that, you know, we stopped thinking about whales as just huge quantities of blubber to be mined in the oceans for us, when we understood that they were singing to each other, that they were communicating with each other. It changed something in our brains, and we no longer think it's acceptable to just go out, you know, like Moby Dick and kill them.
Right, for lamp oil. Yeah,
for lamp oil.
No, yeah. I'd say we've certainly come a long way, but yeah, I was thrilled to see that she was having that sensitivity to anything alive. You know, I mean, we have to eat as humans, and I'm primarily plant-based consuming, but you know, to examine our ethics when it comes to the decisions we make about how we feed ourselves and how we nourish and how we exploit nature, you know, farming and agriculture, and what are the limits, and, you know, what terrain do we, you know, like palm oil comes to mind, you know, and we decide that biodiesel and cooking oil is more important than ecodiversity and you know,
than Borneo itself.
Right. Yeah. Borneo itself. And yeah, so I'm glad she's doing that work, because that might usher in the next generation or so this lens to look through, and because right now it sounds like hippie trite to say, oh, don't kill the rainforest, but no, it's a connection. And we're seeing that in Brazil. We're seeing, you know, we've cleared all this land for cattle, again, for hamburgers or whatever. but it's going to
Or
have an
soy
impact.
for hamburgers.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a high potential for desertification there, and a reality of desertification.
Well, it
and,
looks like we're going to have it within 20 years.
Right.
I mean, it's going so fast.
Yeah.
And here, and even a few years ago, nobody wanted to hear about the Amazon anymore. We were like done with that. We we can't do anything about it. And I mean, this is a little off. I'm going to hang on that little thread again. But the thing is if we don't stop eating meat, we're not going to make it. I think that's very much if I had to say something to a young person today about how you want to rebel, from one extreme, it's up to 14% of all fossil fuels are going into the production of meat.
Mm.
But really, when you put that all together, if you just read Jonathan Safran-Foer's book on eating animals, it's closer to 51% of all petrochemicals goes into the production of meat.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to do one thing to stop it for yourself, but also as a movement. I come out of the generation, I'm a little too young for it, but that stopped the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to stop that destruction, which is, we could go into how bad it is, and it's much worse than just about anybody I know because I'm reading about it every day. That kind of movement is what I would recommend to young people.
Mm-hmm.
Organize, start with your cafeterias, start with your friends. It's got to be on the level of uncool if we're going to stop this. I can't even say climate change anymore. It's a climate catastrophe. It is so far out of what people imagine it's going to be that we're at the 11th hour. It may be 11:59. Again, this is a stretch for where, but I'm sure that this is going to be in the third part of the trilogy. Will be about climate catastrophe, because you can see that that's what we're building through these two films that you've seen already.
Yeah. So I'm glad we segued into that. And I'm with you. And so to also temper that just a skosh is, I can't stand vegan activism. I'm just going to go ahead and say it, because it's proselytizing, it's shaming, and yada yada yada.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that against all pure plant-based diet people. So, but there is a contingency within or subpopulation within veganism that is just atrocious, and they're obnoxious. So to the meat eaters who are watching this, I'll say it's about percentages. Cut 10% of your meat diet out. We have 21 meal periods in a week. And so my wife and I try to do 19 of those 21 as pure vegetable-based, pure plant-based diet. And then we have 2 meals that might have dairy or a little bit of fish or something like that. So it's all in the numbers. And so even if the entire population of the earth cut back 10% or 20% on meat consumption, that's, I think, the real positive takeaway that we can consider palatable and negotiable and open for discussion. So it's, we love to argue in binary terms. So it's either veganism or you're just going to McDonald's every day and eating the triple pounder or whatever they call those things. And it's not about that. It's about finding a nice place, a nice equilibrium in the middle of all of that suits you. And if you only do 5 or 10%, that's great. You're doing something.
Yeah, I do hear what you're saying. I would say, as someone who's been a vegetarian for a long, long time, I find it just easier to give it up. I don't even think it's not even in my, I just don't think about it. Sometimes I'll look at people in the meat counter and just go, oh, what are they doing? It's more like I just don't know. And it wasn't, I didn't give up meat because I thought it tastes terrible. I did it originally because I care about animals, and I will still eat some fish because my family's from Gloucester, which was the largest seaport in the United States for 250 years. Yeah. Although we don't have any more fish there now, but I do think that I know what you mean about anything American. Sometimes we get so adamant in our positions and sort of puritan. I mean, I think it's the puritanical streak in us that's all black and white. I do agree with you there, but I also think that it has to become something like uncool. That's the way that our society moves. Is just, it's like, what's he doing over there? Why would you do that? I mean, not to mention the fact that vegetarians live on average 6 years longer than meat eaters. I mean, it's like smoking practically anyway. But
right.
I mean, but the real reason is that it's not only not to be cruel to animals, it's also to save ourselves. That's what's going on here.
Yeah.
And we don't have so many options anymore, and it's one of the best.
And my final plug for going to plant-based is fragility. And we're seeing food scarcity popping in here and there a little bit. We've had a pandemic for a couple of years, and we've had supply chain issues and things like that. And I haven't looked at the price of meat lately, but I think the fragility that is there, that to produce meat takes effort and energy and resources. And so to eat chickpeas or other sources of vegetable protein, plant protein, that level of fragility, or whatever you want to call it, stability on the flip side, you're better grounded there. So like you said, I don't miss meat. I don't crave a burger. I don't eat red meat anymore at all. I don't eat poultry. If somebody sets a plate in front of me, I'm not going to sit and get all sort of outraged about it. I'll eat them. Sure. I'll eat it. But as a rule, I will never shop for that. So that's another argument for it, is that if you can get used to eating mostly plant stuff, that if beef suddenly skyrockets in prices, and we've seen that with the baby formula thing that's going on right now. The Abbott Corporation, they contaminated their batch, and suddenly there's a lot of fragility there. There's a lot of susceptibility to, or vulnerability, I should say. And so I see that in meat consumption, that given that it's a complex part of our agroeconomic system, that it would be wise to condition yourself to not miss it or not crave it, and so anyway, that would be my final plug for somebody.
I think our thread might have broken.
We've digressed, and that's fine. I mean,
sure.
If we've driven off 10, 15 viewers, that's fine, because there might still be people here that are just saying, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Sure. All right, well, let's reel ourselves back in, and we can start to wrap things up, because I know we talked about an hour, and we're about an hour. Okay. 18 now. Yeah. So there was, you mentioned Matteo Ricard, and that was really neat to see him. I've been following him on social media for a while. And speaking of empathy and compassion for animals, I know he's a vegetarian or a vegan, but it's tied into his Buddhist beliefs, and I think that's woven into their belief system. It was great seeing him in the show. And Josefa came back. From
Heart of Skay.
From Heart of Skay, and she is one of the shamanic people that you had talked about, or the other term that I won't be able to remember probably for a while yet.
Curandera.
Curandera?
It's like cure.
Curandera. Okay, so now I can hook it. Okay, now I'll remember. Curandera. You have some really amazing protagonists in the film, and I think the topic of consciousness and the topic of what emerges from that discussion, which is in some sense spirituality, and also in some sense of having an empirical grounding of what we could explicate in terms of consciousness, what we think we can understand about consciousness. Like you said, in psychedelic research, the new frontiers that are opening up there in not even altered consciousness, but maybe an expanded consciousness, or more accessible consciousness, or a reconnecting to that again, which is ineffable, is deeply fascinating. So if there are folks watching that are not aware of aware, I would suggest that you become aware of aware and engage with it, and watch it, because it's really a good introduction to consciousness. Like if you're here and you haven't even thought about asking some of these bigger questions, it's a great place to start.
Well, it's meant as a provocation, the film, which I think, to my mind, is certainly, maybe not every time, but I think it's the best thing you can do in documentary, is that what we started doing was we used this metaphor of the elephant, or the Indian fable of the elephant, where the king sends the 6 blind people out into the night to discover what this ruckus is, and they all come back with a different description depending on which part of the elephant they happen to have touched. And I mean, that was a great metaphor to use when we were writing the film, or the treatment of the film. But in end effect, what surprised me most in the entire film was how similar. I mean, we went literally to all over the earth to find these people with very radically different takes on consciousness, or research projects into consciousness. And I think what we really did not expect was, we thought we'd have little mosaics of an elephant at the end, and there was so much overlap with these people, whether it was a Tibetan Buddhist monk, or whether it was a philosopher, or whether it was psilocybin research, or a neuroscientist, or a plant researcher. That just, it shocked me, honestly. It's like, oh my God, this isn't just a mosaic. I can see an elephant here. I mean, I don't know what the elephant is or what it's doing, but I would get back to this, that this film is preaching to the converted. It's really to ask you, the viewer, what your own view is of consciousness, or whether you even thought about it. I mean, I certainly am one of those people who didn't think about it very much before in my life. And so that you come away not adopting one of these people, or everybody, or the viewpoint of the film. There is no one viewpoint of the film. It's really about you starting your own investigation into consciousness and your own consciousness.
Yeah, I agree, because it's the film is objective and agnostic. It just presents you with half a dozen people with different perspectives. And you had mentioned the philosopher, and it was Professor Boothby, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Richard
so
Boothby.
I want to make sure he gets referenced in this conversation, because that was and it was a psychedelic sort of revelation and a little bit of epiphany that changed the trajectory of his life, as it did yours. I think that you are more open to, the door's a little wider open to what we could call spirituality, and I think that's a good takeaway.
Well, I feel like I'm just beginning. I feel like I'm just beginning.
Yeah.
Maybe not too late, but we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get involved until a couple of years ago, and I went right down the rabbit hole. And this is part of why I do these conversations, is I want to have just yet another conversation in the world that can be discovered by someone that may, like your film, may just alter the trajectory just a little bit, or open up the sense of the desire for inquiry. And for me, that's the central point of how I think I present myself and how I wish to express myself, is to have this unending inquiry, and just bracketing the answers that come to me, and then trying to understand the answers, but without really wearing them very heavily, and wearing them as some sort of final statement on something. So I am always open to the endless inquiry, and that's why I like conversations with folks like yourself. Before we say goodbye to each other, Kent, you had alluded to this as that Aware was the second part of a possible trilogy. Do you have a timeline-ish kind of thing for when you might?
We don't have a timeline, and if we did, we'd just get into trouble anyway.
Okay.
And even saying that it will include the coming climate catastrophe. I mean, of course, there are many films on. In fact, I was just watching Attenborough's film about. I have to say, wonderful film. Netflix, but wonderful film that he did on how nature is just diminished right in front of him over these. I mean, very poignant.
Oh, I heard about that. Yeah.
It's not. You don't necessarily think of, I mean, he's such a big name that you don't necessarily think of him doing a film like this, but it's very personal. And there's a moment in that film where it's so sad, which I think has to happen, is that we need to understand what we are losing in order to really comprehend what's going to happen. But anyway, back to the third part of the trilogy will be about the climate catastrophe, but it's going to be from a very different perspective than than, you know, BBC or Nature Productions, or, you know, it's, and how we go about that, we don't know ourselves. I mean, that's what we like about being documentary filmmakers, that every one of these films has been a voyage. We didn't know what the Maya thought when we started. We certainly didn't know what we thought about, still don't, about consciousness. And with the climate catastrophe, I mean, it incorporates everything that we love. I mean, that's a daunting and impossible task.
Yeah, yeah. And will there be a link or a segue from Aware and from Heart of Skay to this, so there'll be a transition moving in?
Yes, I think that certainly very good question. Certainly the indigenous viewpoint will be represented rather by the Maya. It could be the Aborigines. Monica has very good ties to the Aboriginal community in Australia.
Oh, okay.
And Monica will be in it. In fact, I'll be seeing Monica on, believe it or not, on Saturday. We're going to present the film in London on Saturday. So with her, and then we'll be hanging out with Monica, discussing what we might do. I mean, she's such a wonderful human being and charismatic that it would be difficult not to include her. But but it's certainly, I think that the, you know, coming full circle is that, you know, something that that Monica talks about in this film is that I don't want to be simplistic about it, but it is amazing to me, researching consciousness, how many things were, as though we'd come full circle in science to what the indigenous people have been telling us for millennia. Now, I don't want to be overly simplistic about that, because it's, you know, first of all, there are thousands of different cultures that are indigenous, and that word doesn't always hold up. But it is interesting seeing these two things in some ways combine. I mean, the idea that plants are sentient isn't something you're going to have a hard time convincing most indigenous or other peoples about. I mean, they innately believe that, like my grandfather.
Right.
And yet there it is. You know, there we are again. We've come, and many of these. So that is definitely one of the things that glues all of these films. That's one of these threads that comes all the way through the film.
Okay.
And you know, for me, it could end in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan Bible again. You know, or rather, we're going to survive this creation of the human being too. Is an open question. Yeah,
good point. And I think that's a great way to wrap up our first conversation. And when part 3 manifests itself through you, I will reach out to you, and if you have time and space and can make it, then we'll have another conversation.
Yeah, because love to. And maybe include Frauke, you know.
That would be wonderful. That would be
the brains of our operation. You know.
Oh, good. Even deeper conversations, because you and I had a pretty good conversation just now. So that's right. Expanding that into a triad, that would be really cool. So I would look forward to that. Eric Black, thank you so much for joining me today in a conversation.
Thank you.
I very much appreciate it. And I wish to thank the YouTube viewers who are still with us at this point. I say this in every interview. If you've made it this far, I honor you for listening to what I consider to be an engaging and important conversation. So thank you. And Eric, I'll say goodbye to you after we stop record. And
you have the sites where these films are available.
Yeah, all relevant information will be made available down below for both the films. Yeah. And I'll also put your IMDb link in there, because you do have other films out there. And if people are curious, I want to put that in as well. So I'll stop record, and thank you again, YouTube audience, for your attendance. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate it.